I just would love viewers and for others, starting with you, to appreciate how humiliating it is for a teacher at the end of one's career to be let out in front of one's students. You can only do that if I was an immediate harm to the students, that I was considered an immediate harm because I was telling them the truth.
Imagine being a history teacher who gets suspended for teaching history. That's what one BC high school teacher claims is his current reality after he dared to let students know historical truths that contradicted the mainstream narrative on what was actually discovered last year at the former Kamloops Indian residential school. Drea Humphrey here with Rebel News, and you may want to grab yourself a cup of coffee or a cup of kombucha because you're not going to want to miss a minute of this interview with cancel culture's latest victim, Jim McMurtry. Mr. McMurtry, as I'm sure his students call him, is the son of former Ontario MLA and retired Chief Justice of Ontario, Roy McMurtry. The Honourable Roy McMurtry is known for being a social justice and human rights defender to the point that he even received a threatening letter, which he calls a badge of honour, from former Ku Klux Klan head Grand Wizard David Duke back in 1977. The letter was a stop or else warning after members of the Western Guard, an unofficial Toronto-based arm of the KKK, were prosecuted for some of their racial violence. While Roy McMurtry's son Jim did take a run for politics like his father when he ran as a Liberal MP candidate, he's made the most of his career instead serving as an award-winning educator for nearly 40 years. That was until March 31st of last year when he says after teachers were asked to discuss the then recent claim that the remains of 215 children were found buried at the former Kamloops Indian residential school, he was marched out of an Abbotsford high school math class that he was substituting for and promptly put on an 8-month suspension. Why? Because the expert in history dared to educate his students on the most common cause of death at the time such schools ran, which is easily verifiable as illnesses, especially tuberculosis. In fact, the disease was so prevalent at the time that just a 20-minute drive away from the former Kamloops Indian residential school is the Tranquil Sanatorium, which was built to treat hundreds of tuberculosis patients and ran as such until the disease was no longer running rampant in the late 1950s. But because that little bit of history doesn't quite align with the prominent false narrative, which is still swarming, which is that 215 murdered children's bodies had been discovered in a mass grave at the school, the Abbotsford School District deemed Mr. McMurtry's comments as inflammatory, inappropriate, insensitive, and contrary to the district's message of condolences and reconciliation. Now, those of you who have watched my Rebel News exclusive documentary called Kamloops: The Buried Truth by subscribing at rebelnewsplus.com know that such comments are no such thing. The Tk'emlúps government never said they found a mass grave. And to date, not a single body, let alone murdered child's body, has ever been discovered even in an individual unmarked grave at the school's site. Now, listen to this. Just a couple of months ago, a Chilliwack, BC teacher named Lyle Nickel, who allegedly hugged students, kissed one on the forehead, was meeting students outside of school for lunch, drunk texting them, and even telling one of them how much he loves them, was suspended for 1 month. That's right, 1 month. Yet you're about to hear Jim's side of the story while he's still off work, awaiting the fate of his career since the Abbotsford School District has recommended he be terminated. But you should also know that I did reach out to that district so that you could be informed on their side of the story with a series of allegations against McMurtry as well. Those series of allegations include that he didn't wear his PPE correctly and that he made inappropriate jokes. I also wanted to know if teachers in their district were educated about or allowed to inform students without the fear of being disciplined about what was actually discovered at Kamloops Indian Residential School last year. such as ground penetrating radar, cannot confirm if there are bodies underground, and that even the expert whose report is what started the discovery claim says she found 200 probable targets of interest rather than 215 children's remains, and that only excavation would be able to determine what's actually buried there. I also wanted to know, since Mr. McMurtry was dragged out of his class for teaching outside of their box, did their district make any steps to redact the misinformation that they had spread about the former residential school, like in this tweet, when they stated that there were 215 children's remains found in a mass grave? Crickets. Silence. No response. But do you know who refuses to be silent about this? Mr. McMurtry. All right, Jim, thanks for having us in your place to tell the world about your important story that you're going through right now. Why don't you start explaining your history with education?
Well, thank you very much. I'm someone who did a PhD at the University of Toronto. I wanted to be a professor. The opportunity didn't come my way. Became a high school teacher, didn't leave, loved it, was a principal for a number of years. Lived in different parts of Canada, taught and was administrator in Switzerland. So I've had interesting opportunities, but mostly, teacher.
Wow, that is a good resume. Yet here you are at home for over 2 years, not able to get into the classroom and teach the minds of the future. Tell us briefly what's going on. Why is that the case?
Well, if I may say that I was first suspended 7 months and then a second time for 8 months, and then there's all sorts of other things that prevent me from going back. And I think it's relating to cancel culture, that there's a war on words. But for many people, they look at people in the media, Jordan Peterson and Lindsay Shepherd, Rex Murphy, who, or someone, Wendy Mesley, Don Cherry, that sort of thing, and you don't really think of. It's important for, what happens to teachers because there's many of us, but I think it's in many ways more important because the children, they need their advocates. And I think children in the classroom want to have debate. They want to be able to have a different opinion. They want to be able to question and to reflect and to critically think, all these things that schools are supposed to do. So I'm that. I'm just somebody that felt the Canadian schools were really great and saw that there was storm clouds in the distance, and now they're over top of us. And I think it's really sad that there's so many topics that are now off the table.
Now, you're also a history teacher, sticking to the facts with the history. And one of the reasons why you are in so much trouble and waiting to have your fate decided for you is because you spoke some truths about the deaths that happened during the residential school. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I'd be happy to do it. So I was at a school, and because I'd had difficulty with my employer, I asked to be a teacher on call, and I speak French, so there was a need to have a regular teacher on call for French. And I went in front of a grade 12 calculus class, but it was May 31st, a year ago, 2021, and news had come out about the 215 children who were found in a mass grave, presumably murdered if they're in a mass grave. And I only said one thing that was counter to the narrative, because kids were talking about priests and nuns being murderers and torturers and having done other things to violate, children. I said, because I'm well read in the area as a history teacher, that most of the children in residential schools died from disease, such as tuberculosis. I wasn't trying to be controversial. I was already under suspension at the time, but everything was going fine. But as soon as I said that, I upset some kids in the class because they really believed that the kids had been murdered. And about 15 minutes later, we had a little break. And then at the end of the break, I guess one of the girls had gone down and talked to a guidance counselor, and the guidance counselor talked to the principal. And the principal talked to my employer, and the employer decided to remove me from the school. So I was walked out. And I didn't really understand why, because I thought it had by the way, all the teachers were supposed to, at that time, that day, talk about what the news was, the 215 children found in a mass grave. And so I didn't know what I had said wrong, even. And it was really, again, that I was off script in that way, that it wasn't disease, it was murder. Now, of course, no one's dug up any graves in Kamloops because people know it's not true. And there were only 51 children that ever died while enrolled at the school, and they have the death certificates, and they know where they died, mostly in the local hospital or back on the reserve. So the story is complete fabrication, but it's cost me my career.
Well, some people watching and hearing what you're saying may also have some of the same feelings that your students had when you spoke some of that. But myself and the BC producer behind the camera, Matt Brevner, do know what you're talking about. In fact, if you go to kamloopsdocumentary.com, you can find a 2-day investigative documentary that we did together to just show that, after more than a year, there have been no bodies discovered for the claim that was once told to the world that 215 kids were found. Now, that you and I know is controversial, but to actually be suspended for that, why do you think that's happening?
Okay, and if I just say, just in anticipation of that, I just would love viewers and for others, starting with you, to appreciate how humiliating it is for a teacher at the end of one's career to be let out in front of one's students. They can only do that if I was an immediate harm to the students, that I was considered an immediate harm because I was telling them the truth. Oh, I think the whole idea behind cancel culture is people use their institutions to give attention to themselves. I think people like our Prime Minister really want to present themselves as the savior of the people. They want to invent all sorts of things that are really horrible about Canada's past, even though Canada is one of the most extraordinary countries in the world today, and certainly back then too. I think it's just a way of getting everybody to look at them and pretend that they're able to right all the wrongs in history. And of course, I think they make them worse. All they do is they create falsehoods and blood libels against people who, like the priests and nuns, like the Oblate priests and the Sisters of St. Anne, who gave their lives over to the children, the Kamloops Reserve School. So the idea that there'd be 215 dead children in a mass grave in Kamloops, when you said it went around the world, it also said that there were bodies found of children as young as 3. That they haven't even found a grave. So it's just the most interesting story. The New York Times, Washington Post, the Times of London, like all these newspapers, on the basis of one person saying something that was completely fabulous, would all of a sudden accept as truth. And here I am as a teacher, with a lot of degrees and a lot of experience in the classroom and a lot of publications. Nobody believes me, and yet I'm saying things that are established. I would never say to students, I don't want students to think like I do. I would hate that. I show them the facts, the established facts, and let them create their own perspective and their own interpretation. It's not my business to tell them how to think, but I certainly can help lead them to a credible account of history, an honest appraisal of history. But that's not what the school system is doing. The school system is right now is run by people who want to manipulate children, want to get a bunch of converts into this radical, hard left cause of creating a society where there's equality between all groups, and we can try and raise one group. But another way of doing it, of course, is to lower other groups, and I just think this is so unfair, and particularly again to the men and women who devoted themselves to educating Indigenous youth.
Well, certainly division is becoming a norm in society these days, unfortunately. I think it's important for our viewers to know that this isn't your first time, your first brush with controversy. In fact, previously you were found guilty of misconduct, professional misconduct. Maybe speak to that for our viewers.
Sure. Now, I've only been in trouble with this new board. So 3 years ago, I moved to a new district. And the Abbotsford School District, where I still technically work, they were giving out Bibles up until, Gideon Bibles up until 2016. And the reason they were doing that is because it's a Christian community, and presumably they wanted to disseminate the values of the community. And it's just so it's interesting. When I went there and went into the classroom, I was so worried that I was so careful to not to do anything that would in any way inflame local religious opinion. And yet that has, that's the thing that's been the saving grace for me, because I think what I'm sensing from the religious community in Abbotsford is that they don't want to impugn. They want to lift up. They want to inspire. And it's just so different from what I'm experiencing. This whole idea of I'm supposed to say, Europeans are terrible, and all men are terrible, and all straight people are terrible, and it's just so contrary to what my job is. Now, so I haven't been found guilty of professional misconduct ever, and I've won 2 teaching awards. But my employer in Abbotsford suspended me and investigated me for absolutely nothing, and the union is grieving that. It just hasn't. It's been 3 years, and it still hasn't come up. I think my employer realized it didn't have anything. So what they do with investigations is they're not trying to ferret out the truth. They're trying to build their case. And so they started a second investigation when I told you that I didn't say all these children had been murdered. And that was closed with a recommendation to have me terminated. But I haven't been found guilty of anything. I haven't been in front of the British Columbia has a regulation board called the Teacher Regulation branch for teachers, and I haven't been in front of them. I've got an appeal waiting, but they're so nervous about me that they went to a second investigation, and they went to, again, a recommendation for dismissal, because they know there's a problem with me, and the problem is that everything I say is right, that you don't take advantage of children, you don't lie to children, you don't decide anything for children, you don't push puberty blockers before someone is old enough to decide for him or herself to do something so drastic. You don't get into, you don't interfere with a parent's relationship with a child. You don't play games and hide secrets from kids. And more in relation to me, you don't denigrate one race or group of people to raise others. You don't shame white children in the classroom to make non-white children feel better. It doesn't make any sense to me. If I think my goal as a teacher, and everybody's goal in the educational world, should be to make every kid feel a little bit better about him or herself. You see, didn't say they, did I? And the pronouns, it's unbelievable. There are teachers in Canada who have lost their jobs because they don't want to use the pronouns. So what's happening is a group of people, it's very Marxist, communistic, it's very totalitarian, Orwellian, is that they want to have everybody, not just employees but students, use the language of a group of people who are manipulating for their own self-interest, for their own promotion, into adopting. Really, it's become a cult. I think the whole woke thing, postmodernism, diversity, equity, inclusion, all these lovely words that are the opposite from they mean. War is peace, and it's awful. If the fact that they can say I'm guilty of professional misconduct to me is nothing but laughable, because they know that they are guilty themselves. And I think the end result of this will be that there is going to be an internal investigation of my district and how this can come about. And a lot of people say, "Oh, that won't happen because they have all the power." And I say, no. I don't think in the end. I think in the end, the kids have the power. It's a weird thing to say, but as a teacher, if you can do anything, in talk about many different subjects with students, if they like you and see you as a good person, it doesn't matter if you say things that their parents don't like. The parents see you through their children. And I think, it's just too early still for this new ideology. This, as I said earlier, the storm cloud that's come across. It will pass because it's absolutely nonsensical. But I think when parents start to see that children aren't making up their own minds about their sexuality, about how they view themselves, how they view other groups, other people in society, that they always have to follow what others are telling them, I think they're going to be quite appalled. I think, again, the most important thing is the word education is from the Latin and Greek educere or educare, meaning to develop and to lead out. It's not to indoctrinate. It's not to impose. It's not to get them to be like us or to whatever we are. I think it's just such an incredible dereliction of educational duty.
Well, you certainly gave a lot of nuggets for people to consider today. What message do you have for other teachers who maybe feel the same way you do? Maybe they feel muzzled when it comes to educating their students. And what's next for you?
Well, I think teachers have to realize that, why they became teachers. I certainly understand it's really, really difficult to be me because my career's over. I've been threatened for a few years now because I'm just wanting kids to entertain different perspectives on sensitive issues. It's not, I would never have one viewpoint for my students. And I think it's this absolute outrage that this is what's happening. And so I say to teachers, if there's anything to do, it's to get stronger. And don't do what I've done, which is to say absolutely no, I'm not going to go back on my principles, and you're wrong. You're absolutely wrong to indoctrinate children. But it'd be a lot easier for teachers that are being run out of the profession like me if there are more teachers in the classroom who are talking about these issues and were less afraid. I just would maybe mention a Burke quote that really sticks in my head. All that it takes for the triumph of evil is for good men and women to do nothing. And I think there's far too many teachers, too many parents, too many students, too many people doing nothing. They know it's wrong.
Thank you so much for being on Rebel News.
Oh, it's a pleasure meeting you, Drea.
If you're not a fan of truth being canceled, check out our exclusive investigative documentary, Kamloops, The Buried Truth. You can do so by becoming a rebelnewsplus.com subscriber, which also helps support our independent journalism.